The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand halls of Windsor Castle as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. As the head of palace security, Thomas had seen many things during his 15 years of service, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. Thomas was a man of integrity, known throughout the palace for his unwavering dedication and sharp eye for detail. His colleagues respected him, and the royal family trusted him completely. At 42, he had worked his way up from a junior guard to his current position, earning every promotion through hard work and an spotless record. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Thomas made his rounds, checking security protocols and ensuring all systems were functioning properly. The palace was buzzing with its usual activity. Staff members hurrying about their duties, gardeners tending to the magnificent grounds, and kitchen staff preparing for the day's meals. Princess Charlotte, now a young woman of 18, had always been Thomas's favorite among the royal children. She possessed a natural warmth and genuine kindness that reminded him of her grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. Charlotte had grown into a thoughtful and observant person, qualities that would prove crucial in the events to come. On this particular morning, Charlotte was walking through the East Wing when she noticed something unusual. The corridor that led to the private offices was unusually quiet, and she could hear muffled voices coming from behind a door that was typically locked during this time of day. Her curiosity piqued. She moved closer, careful to remain hidden behind a large decorative pillar. What Charlotte heard made her blood run cold. Through the slightly open door, she could clearly make out Camilla's voice, along with two other people she didn't recognize. They were discussing something that sounded very serious and potentially harmful to her father, King Charles. "The documents need to be handled carefully," Camilla was saying. "If anyone discovers what we've been doing, it could destroy everything we've worked for." Charlotte pressed herself against the pillar, her heart racing. She strained to hear more, but the voices became quieter. She caught fragments of conversation that mentioned financial arrangements, hidden accounts, and most disturbing of all, removing obstacles. A man's voice, deep and unfamiliar, responded, "The transfers have been completed as requested. No one will be able to trace them back to you. But we need to be more careful about the king's involvement in palace decisions." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine. What were they talking about? What transfers? And why did they seem concerned about her father's involvement in his own palace? Camilla's voice became clearer again. "Charles trusts me completely. He has no idea about any of this, and it needs to stay that way. The last thing we need is him asking uncomfortable questions." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Charlotte couldn't make out all the details. What she heard was enough to fill her with dread and confusion. The stepmother she had learned to accept, if not love, was apparently involved in something secretive and potentially damaging. As the meeting seemed to be concluding, Charlotte quickly made her way back down the corridor, her mind racing with what she had overheard. She knew she needed to tell someone, but who could she trust? Her father was apparently being kept in the dark about whatever was happening. Her brother William was away on official duties, and she wasn't sure who else in the palace she could confide in. Then she thought of Thomas Mitchell. Throughout her childhood, Thomas had always been a reassuring presence in the palace. He had taught her about security protocols when she was younger, always taking time to answer her questions and treat her with respect rather than just formal courtesy. If anyone would know what to do with this information, it would be Thomas. Charlotte spent the rest of the morning trying to find an opportunity to speak with Thomas privately. The palace was always busy, and finding a moment alone with the head of security without drawing attention would be challenging. She needed to be careful. If Camilla or her associates discovered that someone had overheard their conversation, it could put Charlotte in danger. Finally, during the afternoon, Charlotte noticed Thomas conducting his regular inspection of the security office. This was her chance. She made her way to that section of the palace, trying to appear casual and unhurried. "Thomas," she called softly as she approached the security office. "Could I speak with you for a moment? It's quite important." Thomas looked up from his checklist, immediately noticing the serious expression on Charlotte's face. In all his years of service, he had rarely seen the young princess look so troubled. "Of course, Your Highness," he replied, setting aside his work. "What can I do for you?" Charlotte glanced around nervously, making sure they were alone. "Not here," she whispered. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Somewhere we won't be overheard?" Thomas's professional instincts kicked in immediately. Something was clearly wrong, and Charlotte's cautious behavior suggested it was something serious. He led her to a small, secure room that was used for confidential security briefings. Once the door was closed, Charlotte took a deep breath and began to recount what she had overheard that morning. As she spoke, Thomas's expression grew increasingly grave. He listened without interruption, his experienced mind already analyzing the implications of what Charlotte was telling him. "Are you absolutely certain about what you heard?" Thomas asked when Charlotte finished her account. "Yes," Charlotte replied firmly. "I know it sounds unbelievable, but I heard every word clearly. Thomas, I'm scared. What if Camilla is planning something terrible? What if my father is in danger?" Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. If Charlotte's account was accurate, they were dealing with a situation that could threaten not only the king, but the entire royal family and the monarchy itself. As head of security, it was his duty to investigate any potential threat, no matter how unlikely it might seem. "Princess Charlotte," Thomas said carefully, "what you've told me is extremely serious. I need you to understand that if we pursue this, there could be significant consequences. Are you prepared for that?" Charlotte nodded without hesitation. "My father's safety is more important than anything else. If Camilla is betraying his trust, he needs to know." Thomas spent the next few hours quietly investigating Charlotte's claims. Using his security clearance, he began checking financial records, communication logs, and access reports. What he found disturbed him greatly. There were indeed irregularities in financial transfers, unexplained meetings, and several instances where Camilla had accessed areas of the palace that were typically off-limits to everyone except the king himself. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling. Thomas realized that he was facing one of the most difficult decisions of his career. Confronting the queen consort with accusations of betrayal could destroy his position and potentially harm the royal family if he was wrong. But ignoring potential threats to the king would be a dereliction of his duty. As evening approached, Thomas made his decision. He would continue his investigation, but he would also begin preparing for a direct confrontation with Camilla. The king's safety and the integrity of the monarchy were too important to risk. Meanwhile, Charlotte returned to her quarters, her mind still reeling from the morning's revelations. She had done the right thing by telling Thomas, but now she faced an agonizing wait to see what would happen next. The palace around her suddenly felt different, less safe, more filled with hidden dangers and secret agendas. That night, neither Charlotte nor Thomas slept well. Both were acutely aware that they had set in motion events that could change everything. The comfortable certainties of palace life had been shattered, replaced by suspicion and fear. Thomas spent the late hours reviewing security protocols and planning his next moves. He knew that once he confronted Camilla, there would be no turning back. The consequences could be severe for everyone involved, but his duty was clear. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the palace windows, Thomas prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging day of his professional life. The time for investigation was nearly over. Soon, it would be time for action. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension hanging over the palace. Thomas had spent the entire night gathering evidence and planning his approach. His investigation had revealed more disturbing details about Camilla's activities, including secret financial transactions and unauthorized communications with outside parties. Thomas discovered that significant sums of money had been transferred from royal accounts to offshore holdings without proper documentation. The transfers were expertly hidden, but his security clearance allowed him to trace the digital footprints that others couldn't see. Each discovery made the situation more serious and more dangerous. At 7 in the morning, Thomas received an encrypted message on his secure communication device. The message was brief but alarming. Meeting today at 2 p.m. East Wing Private Office. Ensure no interruptions. Final phase begins. The message was sent from Camilla's personal device. Thomas realized that whatever Camilla was planning was about to reach a critical stage. He could no longer afford to simply observe and gather evidence. The time had come for direct action. Charlotte, meanwhile, was trying to maintain her normal routine while fighting off waves of anxiety. During breakfast with her father, she struggled to act naturally. King Charles noticed his daughter's unusual quietness, but attributed it to the typical stresses of royal life. "You seem troubled this morning, Charlotte," the king observed gently. "Is everything all right?" Charlotte's heart raced. She wanted desperately to tell her father everything, but she knew that without concrete proof, her accusations could be dismissed as misunderstandings or teenage drama. She had to trust that Thomas would handle the situation properly. "I'm fine, Papa," she managed to say. "Just thinking about my upcoming responsibilities." King Charles smiled warmly at his daughter. "You're growing into a remarkable young woman. Your grandmother would be very proud of you." The mention of Queen Elizabeth made Charlotte's chest tighten with emotion. She knew that her grandmother would have expected her to protect the family and the crown, no matter the personal cost. After breakfast, Charlotte discreetly made her way to find Thomas. She found him in the main security office, surrounded by computer screens and documents. His usually calm demeanor showed signs of strain. "Thomas," she whispered, approaching his desk carefully. "Have you discovered anything more?" Thomas looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Yes, and it's worse than we initially thought. Princess Charlotte, I need you to stay in your quarters this afternoon. Don't leave for any reason and don't let anyone know where you are." "Why? What's happening?" "I'm going to confront Camilla directly. Based on what I've found, I believe she's involved in a serious conspiracy that threatens your father and the monarchy. The confrontation could be dangerous." Charlotte felt a surge of fear. "Should we tell my father now? Warn him?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet. If I'm wrong about any of this, it could destroy relationships and trust within the royal family permanently. I need to get a confession or undeniable proof before we involve the king." "But what if something happens to you?" "I've prepared detailed reports of all my findings. If anything happens to me, they'll be automatically sent to your brother William and to the Prime Minister's office. You'll be protected." Charlotte reluctantly agreed to stay in her quarters, though every instinct told her she should be doing more to help. As the afternoon approached, Thomas made his final preparations. He activated hidden recording devices and positioned additional security personnel in strategic locations around the East Wing, though he told them only that he was conducting a routine security inspection. At exactly 2 o'clock, Thomas positioned himself near the private office, where he knew Camilla's meeting would take place. He could hear voices inside, Camilla's, and at least 2 others. Taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly on the door. "Come in," Camilla's voice called. Thomas opened the door and stepped inside. Camilla was seated at a large mahogany desk with 2 men in expensive suits whom Thomas didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. "Thomas," Camilla said, her voice carefully controlled. "I wasn't expecting you. We're in the middle of a private meeting." "I'm sure you are," Thomas replied calmly. "That's exactly why I'm here." The 2 men looked uncomfortable and began to stand, but Thomas stepped further into the room, effectively blocking their exit. "Gentlemen, please remain seated. Queen Consort, we need to discuss some irregularities I've discovered in palace security and financial protocols." Camilla's face remained composed, but Thomas could see the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated stress. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Thomas. Perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting at a more appropriate time." "I think now is the perfect time," Thomas continued, "especially since I've been investigating unauthorized financial transfers, secret communications with external parties, and plans that seem designed to undermine King Charles's authority." The room fell silent. One of the unknown men started to reach for his briefcase, but Thomas quickly moved to intercept him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Thomas said firmly. "This conversation is being recorded, and additional security personnel are stationed throughout this wing of the palace." Camilla's careful composure finally began to crack. "Thomas, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. These gentlemen are financial advisors helping me manage some of my personal investments. Personal investments that require access to royal accounts and involve discussions about removing obstacles and keeping the king uninformed." The color drained from Camilla's face. She realized that someone had overheard her previous conversations. "Who told you about that?" she demanded, her voice rising. "It doesn't matter who told me," Thomas replied. "What matters is that I now have extensive evidence of your activities. Financial records, communication logs, access reports, everything needed to prove that you've been systematically working against the king's interests." One of the men finally spoke up. "This is a misunderstanding. We're legitimate business consultants." Thomas turned to face him directly. "Then you won't mind if I verify your identities and business credentials with the appropriate authorities?" The man's silence was answer enough. Camilla stood up abruptly, her royal training helping her regain some composure. "Thomas, even if what you're suggesting were true, do you really think anyone would believe a palace guard over the Queen Consort? Do you understand what you're risking by making these accusations?" "I understand exactly what I'm risking," Thomas replied steadily. "My career, my reputation, possibly my safety. But I also understand what I'm protecting: the king, the royal family, and the integrity of the crown." "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Camilla said, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "There are larger forces at work here, arrangements that go beyond what you can comprehend." "Then enlighten me," Thomas challenged. "Explain why you've been secretly moving money, meeting with unknown associates, and making plans that specifically exclude the king from knowledge of your activities." Camilla looked at her two companions, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, she turned back to Thomas. "You're right about one thing. There are financial arrangements you don't understand. But they're not what you think they are." "Then explain them." Camilla hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Thomas could see that she was calculating whether it would be better to confess, deny everything, or try a different approach entirely. "The transfers you discovered," she began slowly, "were part of a contingency plan. There are threats to the monarchy that Charles doesn't know about, threats that require discreet preparations." "What kind of threats?" "Political movements, economic pressures, forces that want to see the monarchy diminished or eliminated entirely. The money was being secured to ensure the royal family's protection if more direct measures became necessary." Thomas studied her face carefully. "And the discussions about removing obstacles and keeping the king uninformed?" Camilla's composure slipped again. "Charles is idealistic. He believes in transparency and working within existing systems. But sometimes, protecting the crown requires actions that can't be subjected to committee review and public scrutiny. So you decided to take matters into your own hands?" I decided to do what needed to be done to protect the institution we've both sworn to serve. Thomas felt a chill as he realized the full scope of what Camilla was admitting to. This wasn't just financial impropriety or personal ambition. It was a complete betrayal of everything the monarchy was supposed to represent. "Camilla," he said, using her name without title for the first time, "you've just confessed to conspiracy, financial fraud, and treason against the crown you claim to be protecting." The two men stood up suddenly, but Thomas was ready for them. His years of security training kicked in as he quickly activated his emergency alert system, summoning immediate backup to the room. Within moments, the private office was filled with armed security personnel. Camilla and her associates found themselves surrounded, their carefully laid plans crumbling around them. As the reality of her situation became clear, Camilla made one final attempt to regain control. "Thomas, you have no idea what you've done. The consequences of this will reach far beyond what you can imagine." "Maybe," Thomas replied, "but at least there'll be consequences of the truth being revealed rather than the success of your deception." The confrontation had revealed the depth of Camilla's betrayal, but Thomas knew that this was only the beginning. Now came the even more difficult task of informing King Charles that the woman he trusted and loved had been systematically working against him. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation moved swiftly. Within an hour, Camilla and her two associates were in secure detention, while palace security began the delicate process of investigating the full extent of the conspiracy. Thomas found himself facing the most difficult conversation of his life, telling King Charles that his wife had been betraying him. Charlotte, who had been anxiously waiting in her quarters, finally received word from Thomas that the confrontation was over. When she learned that Camilla had essentially confessed to the conspiracy, she felt a mixture of relief and heartbreak for her father. Thomas requested an immediate private audience with the king, citing urgent security matters. King Charles, though puzzled by the formal tone of the request, agreed to meet in his private study at 6 o'clock that evening. As the appointed time approached, Thomas prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be the most challenging conversation of his career. He carried with him comprehensive files containing all the evidence he had gathered, the recordings of Camilla's confession, and a detailed report of the entire investigation. King Charles was reviewing state papers when Thomas arrived. The king looked up with his characteristic warm smile, completely unaware that his world was about to be shattered. "Thomas, you look unusually serious this evening. What's this urgent security matter you needed to discuss?" Thomas took a deep breath, knowing there was no gentle way to deliver this information. "Your Majesty, I need to inform you of a serious threat that has been discovered within the palace itself." The king set aside his papers, his expression becoming more focused. "A threat? What kind of threat?" "Sir, over the past 2 days, I've conducted an investigation into suspicious activities that Princess Charlotte brought to my attention. The investigation has revealed evidence of a conspiracy involving the Queen Consort." King Charles's face went completely blank for a moment, as if his mind couldn't process what he had just heard. "I'm sorry, Thomas. Did you say involving Camilla?" "Yes, sir. I'm afraid so." The king stood up slowly, his years of royal training helping him maintain composure even as his personal world began to collapse. "That's quite an accusation, Thomas. I trust you have substantial evidence to support such a serious claim." Thomas opened his files and began presenting the evidence methodically. Financial records showing unauthorized transfers, communication logs revealing secret meetings, access reports documenting Camilla's presence in restricted areas, and finally, the recording of her confession from that afternoon. As each piece of evidence was presented, Thomas watched the king's face carefully. He could see the progression from disbelief to confusion to dawning horrific realization. When the recording of Camilla's confession played, King Charles sat in complete silence. His hands, normally so steady, began to tremble slightly as he listened to his wife admit to betraying his trust and working against the interests of the crown. When the recording ended, the room remained silent for several long minutes. Thomas waited respectfully while the king processed the devastating revelations. Finally, King Charles spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the financial records, at least 18 months, possibly longer." "And Charlotte discovered this?" "Yes, sir. She overheard a conversation by accident and brought her concerns to me immediately. She was very worried about your safety." King Charles's expression softened slightly at the mention of his daughter's concern for him. "Where is Charlotte now?" "In her quarters, sir. She's been extremely worried about you throughout this entire ordeal." The king nodded slowly. "And Camilla? Where is she now?" "In secure detention along with her 2 associates. They're being held pending your instructions on how to proceed." King Charles walked to the window of his study, looking out at the palace grounds where he had spent so much of his life. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but this personal betrayal made it feel almost unbearable. "Thomas," he said without turning around, "in your professional opinion, how serious is the threat this conspiracy posed?" "Very serious, Your Majesty. The financial transfers alone represent a significant security risk. But more concerning are the political implications. From what I was able to determine, the Queen Consort was working with outside parties who may have had interests contrary to the stability of the monarchy." Did she explain her motivations?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "She claimed she was trying to protect the crown from unspecified threats, but her methods were clearly unauthorized and potentially treasonous. She admitted to deliberately keeping you uninformed because she felt you wouldn't approve of her actions." King Charles finally turned back to face Thomas. The pain in his eyes was evident, but so was his resolve. "What are my options?" "That depends partly on how you want to handle this, sir. From a legal standpoint, the evidence supports charges of conspiracy, fraud, and treason. From a practical standpoint, we need to consider the implications for the monarchy and the royal family." The king returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "The monarchy has survived many crises over the centuries, Thomas. It will survive this one as well." "But I need to think carefully about the best path forward." "Of course, sir. Might I suggest that we also consider Princess Charlotte's role in all of this? She showed remarkable courage and loyalty in bringing this matter to light." A small smile crossed the king's face for the first time since the conversation began. "Yes, she did, didn't she? I'm very proud of her. She was primarily concerned about your safety throughout the entire ordeal, sir." King Charles nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to see Charlotte now, if possible, and then I need to speak with Camilla." "Are you certain you want to speak with her personally, sir? Given the circumstances, it might be advisable to handle communications through official channels." "Thomas, whatever else she may have done, she is still my wife. I need to hear her explanation directly." Thomas understood the king's position, even if he disagreed with it professionally. "Very well, sir. I'll arrange for Princess Charlotte to join us, and then we can discuss the arrangements for your meeting with the Queen Consort." Within minutes, Charlotte arrived at her father's study. She had been crying, Thomas noticed, probably from stress and worry about the entire situation. "Papa," she said, rushing to embrace him. King Charles held his daughter tightly, drawing strength from her presence. "Charlotte, Thomas has told me what you discovered and how you handled it. I'm incredibly proud of you. I was so scared, Papa. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't let anything happen to you." "You did exactly the right thing, my dear. It took tremendous courage to come forward with such serious concerns." Charlotte pulled back to look at her father's face. "Are you going to be all right? I know this must be terribly painful." King Charles was struck by his daughter's maturity and concern for others, even in this difficult moment. I will be all right, Charlotte. The crown has weathered worse storms than this. What's going to happen to Camilla? The king exchanged glances with Thomas. I'm going to speak with her first, try to understand her actions. Then we'll determine the appropriate course of action. Papa, please be careful. If she was willing to betray you once, she might try to manipulate you again. King Charles was again impressed by his daughter's insight. I'll be very careful, I promise. Thomas will be with me. And we'll take all necessary precautions. The meeting with Camilla was arranged for later that evening. Thomas insisted on multiple security measures, including the presence of additional guards and complete recording of the conversation. When Camilla was brought to the king's private study, she looked remarkably composed considering her circumstances. She had clearly spent the hours since her arrest preparing for this conversation. Charles, she began immediately, I know how this must look, but I can explain everything. King Charles studied the woman he had loved and trusted completely. I'm listening. Everything I did to protect you and the crown. There are forces working against the monarchy that you don't know about. Political movements, economic interests, international pressures. I was trying to create safeguards. By secretly moving money and meeting with unknown associates. By ensuring that we would have resources and support if more direct threats materialized. Charles, you're a good man, perhaps too good for the realities of modern political power. Sometimes protecting the crown requires actions that can't be subjected to public scrutiny. King Charles listened carefully, but Thomas could see that he wasn't convinced by her explanations. Camilla, even if I accepted your stated motivations, you betrayed my trust. You made decisions that affected the crown without my knowledge or consent. How can I ever trust you again? For the first time, Camilla's composure cracked slightly. Because you love me, and because I love you. Everything I did was for us. For our future together. No, King Charles replied quietly but firmly. Everything you did was about power and control. Love doesn't require deception, and protecting the crown doesn't require betraying the king. The conversation continued for another hour, but it became clear that there was no path to reconciliation. Camilla had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, violated trusts that couldn't be restored. When the meeting ended, King Charles made his decision. Camilla would face full legal consequences for her actions. The marriage would be annulled, and she would be stripped of all royal titles and privileges. The announcement would be made to the public within 48 hours, along with a complete disclosure of the conspiracy and the evidence that brought it to light. As Thomas escorted Camilla back to detention, she made one final attempt to change the king's mind. Charles will regret this decision, she said to Thomas. He doesn't understand the real threats facing the monarchy. When those threats materialize, he'll realize that I was trying to protect him. Perhaps, Thomas replied, but at least he'll face those threats with his integrity intact. In the days that followed, the palace worked to manage the crisis and its aftermath. The public was shocked by the revelations, but there was also widespread support for King Charles's decisive action in dealing with the betrayal. Princess Charlotte emerged from the ordeal with enhanced respect from both the public and the royal family. Her courage in exposing the conspiracy had quite literally saved the crown from a threat that could have destroyed it from within. Thomas received commendations for his professional handling of the investigation and his loyalty to the crown. But perhaps more importantly, he had helped preserve the integrity of an institution that represented centuries of British history and tradition. The monarchy survived, as King Charles had predicted it would. But it emerged stronger, more vigilant, and more committed to the principles of truth and transparency that had always been its foundation. King Charles, though personally devastated by the betrayal, found strength in the knowledge that his family and his kingdom were safe. The crown endured as it always had, protected by those who understood that true loyalty meant defending not just the person of the monarch, but the principles and values that the monarchy represented. In the end, the conspiracy that was meant to protect the crown from outside threats had posed the greatest threat of all, the corruption of the institution from within. Thanks to the courage of a young princess and the integrity of a dedicated guard, that threat had been exposed and eliminated before it could cause irreparable damage.